Now, more than 120 heads of state are meeting in New York later today at the invitation of the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon for a summit aimed at coming up with a new global deal on climate change. But with world leaders focused on so much more, and today, of course, a war on terrorism, not to mention the fragile global economy, is the political will and money still there to tackle the issue of the environment? Well, joining me now to discuss whether the world cares about climate change anymore is Tom Burke, a former advisor to 3 British Environment Secretaries. And in our central London studio are Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of Global Warming Policy Foundation, and Tom Mitchell, Head of the Climate Change Programme at the Overseas Development Institute. To you in the studio first, Tom Burke. Do we care? Look at what's happening today. There's airstrikes across Syria. There's a great deal happening in the world. Do you think climate change is now very much on all governments' back burners?
I think they've got a real issue of priorities, but actually anybody who thinks there's not a connection between the kind of conflict we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment and a world that will be 2 degrees warmer has not really understood the issue. It's not an environmental issue, it's an issue about the prosperity and security of all of us on the planet over the next 30 years.
Benny Pizer, are international governments being short-sighted? As Tom says, it's the financial impacts, the economic impacts, the political impacts of climate change, are they being overlooked?
Well, first of all, a lot of world leaders won't even attend the UN summit, and they're signaling that they have other priorities for not attending. And secondly, their main concern is economic and political, and climate change has dropped down the agenda quite significantly. There are no chances of a legally binding agreement. Everyone realizes that, and also everyone realizes that countries are hungry for more energy.
Tom Mitchell, why has this happened? Why has it dropped down the agenda, do you think?
Well, I think governments find it difficult to plan for the long term when there are pressing immediate needs. But actually, this is what we need from our governments, to actually take responsibility and deal with some of the tougher issues. And a report just out last week, Lord Stern, one of the authors, said that there is actually no trade-off between economic growth and dealing with climate change. Actually, dealing with climate change is good for business. And it's actually our reliance on fossil fuels and our investment in fossil fuels that's causing us a problem now and will lead to risks for our economy.
Tom Burke sitting next to me, you're nodding at that. I mean, is it short-sightedness? Is that fundamentally the big problem?
It's short-sightedness and being distracted, yes. The problems in Syria have as one of their multiple causes the fact that there was a climate-driven drought in the southeast of Syria that drove a lot of people into Damascus, that helped to overstress an already stressed situation, which then broke down. That's exactly what you expect to happen in a changing climate. So if you want to know what failing to deal with this problem will do, Syria's the prequel to Climate Change, the movie. So you want to be really careful before you dismiss this as something to do with, the environment, or we'll run out of energy, or we'll compromise our economy if we deal with this problem. Frankly, quite the opposite is true. We'll do all of the bad things if we don't deal with this problem.
But isn't the problem, Benny Pizer, that people don't seem to make that link? How do you get that message across to governments that, for example, what we are seeing in Syria is intimately linked to the global climate?
Well, first of all, I would question that very assumption. Most governments don't accept that anyhow, that the rise of Islamism is somehow the cause of caused by global warming. Which is somehow ridiculous because it's an international, not a local problem.
Well, let's bring in Tom, because you're saying it's not an assumption. Tom, what's your evidence?
There's a very well documented paper by a former head of the policy planning in the State Department tracing exactly the connection between an unusual sequence of droughts in southeast Syria and the drift of people into Damascus. So that's documented. It's not an assumption. It's a judgment about what an extra stress in an already heavily stressed situation will do. That's the real world we're living in, and one in which there are multiple stresses, and climate change multiplies those stresses.
Benny Pizer?
Well, it's because of these kind of crude arguments that governments no longer listen to these doom-mongers who basically blame everything that is happening in the world on global warming. Obviously, the rise of extreme Islamism has been happening for years, has been happening in many countries, in countries that are wealthy just as much than poor countries. So this is a red herring. The reality is that governments around the world have other priorities, more important priorities, and it shows that they are not taking any significant action on climate change.
Tom Mitchell, are you a doom monger? As we speak, we're looking at all of these pictures of protesters on the streets of New York, and there were protests across the country yesterday in advance of this UN summit. Are all of those people, and you yourself, doom mongers?
I think doom mongers is the wrong word to use. I think actually we need to look at where the scientific consensus is. And that's, many hundreds of scientists coming together under the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, actually saying unequivocally that climate change is happening, it's caused by humans and human emissions. Now, that's not to say that nothing can be done about it, and we have an opportunity to do something about it. It's just, unfortunately, people like Dr. Pizer and the supporters that he has on the kind of the right-wing lunatic side of denying this issue causes a big problem. And I think we've got to get beyond putting a climate skeptic argument forward and get down to the business of actually dealing with the problem.
Dr. Pizer, would you describe yourself as a climate skeptic?
No, we're totally agnostic, and it's not about the science anyhow. It's about what governments are going to do about it. All I'm saying is the reality shows that governments are not going to spend $100 billion per year on climate change. That was the promise by President Obama and Gordon Brown in Copenhagen. When that conference failed, they promised the world, the developing world, $100 billion every year. Obviously, that is not going to happen. And as long as the money isn't going to flow, countries like India, China, and other developing countries are not going to sign up to anything.
Tom Burke here in the studio with me. That is the nub of the problem, isn't it? It's not just the developed world. It's hard enough getting the message across to those of us here in the UK to use less energy, to use more fuel-efficient cars, to change the way energy is generated. When you look at countries like India that are emerging economies, it's much harder, isn't it, to try and get the message across to countries like that where they have poverty, where they have enormous other issues to deal with.
I don't think it's harder to get the message across because the message is now being driven by events. The floods in northern India at the moment are a very good example of that.
It's hard to get them to find the money to spend on it.
Yes, it's hard to get them to find the money to spend on it. It's hard to get the attention that the politicians need. But there will be an agreement in Paris next year on money. I don't have any doubt about that. The real problem here is actually to get people to realize it's not about doom-mongering. There's a much smarter, cleaner, more efficient world available, which will also reduce the pressure on the climate. And we've got to stop thinking about it as binary situation, yes or no, good or bad. It's more complicated. That bit like the situation in the Middle East, more complicated than that, but there's much more opportunity in that than there is threat.
Well, it is clearly a complicated subject and one that we will undoubtedly be discussing at length for the next few years at least. Tom Burke, Tom Mitchell and Benny Pizer, thank you all very much for joining us today.